This is chapter 14, lecture part 2. All right, let's go through another example. So here's an example where we have, there we go. Okay, so we want to know if the pencil technique, so if you remember from a previous class, I told you about the pencil technique that was basically where you put a pencil in your mouth and push it to the back of your mouth, and it forces your face into a smile that's supposedly meant to make you feel happier. So a researcher wants to see if doing that pencil technique actually can reduce participants' anger levels. In order to test this, the participants showed up to the study, and their level of anger was measured when they first arrived. And then after that, all of the participants were made angry, and then they were randomly assigned to either half of them sat quietly for 2 minutes, or the other half of the participants did the pencil technique for 2 minutes instead. And all the participants again had their levels of anger measured after 2 minutes. So this is a little bit of a tricky example because one of the things I first want to point out is something that is not a variable. So although it might seem like a variable, all the participants were made angry. This is something that doesn't vary. And so in that all the participants were experiencing the same thing, it is not a variable in this study. The things that are variables in this study are, first, we have the variable of time. So the first factor in this study that was examined was the time in which people were being measured at. So participants' anger levels were measured at the beginning of the study, before they were made angry, and their levels of anger were also measured at the end of the study. So there were 2 time points in which the anger levels were measured, at the beginning and at the end of the study, or before and after they did either sit quietly or the pencil technique. So either way, they were measured at 2 different time points on their levels of anger. So all the participants were measured at both of those time points. And so the factor of time is an example of a within subjects variable, since all the people were measured at the beginning of the study and all of the people were measured at the end of the study. The other factor in this study is activity. So the thing that the researchers manipulated is what participants did after they were made angry. So you'll notice in the explanation it says half of the participants sat quietly, were told to sit quietly for 2 minutes, and the other half were told to do the pencil technique for 2 minutes. So that factor is whatever activity they were told to do during those 2 minutes. So they were either told to sit or they were told to do the pencil technique. So there are 2 levels for that factor. This factor was measured using the research design of between subjects. So the reason for that is, again, we had half of the people doing one thing, the other half did another thing. So it's different people that sat quietly versus a totally different group of people that did the pencil technique. So that variable was measured in a between subject sort of way. And so what that means is that we would call this Anova that would use to analyze these data, we would call that a 2 by 2. So again, here the first number is representing the number of levels in that first factor, which again we had 2 levels for that first factor. The second number here is representing the number of levels in our second factor, which again people either sat quietly or they did the pencil technique. So that's where the numbers are coming from. And then we would call this a mixed design because this study used a mix of within subjects for one variable and between subjects for the other variable. So that's why it's called a mixed design ANOVA. So now that we understand what the different types of ANOVAs are called, let's talk about what is actually tested in a factorial ANOVA. So within a factorial ANOVA, there are actually a bunch of different hypothesis tests that are being conducted. So the number of hypothesis tests that are going to be conducted actually depends on the number of factors that you have. And so one of the things that changes depending on how many factors you have is the number of different main effects that you're going to be exploring. So when we're thinking about the hypothesis tests related to the main effects, essentially what the main effects looks at is it looks at the effect of one of the factors at a time. So it's almost like pretending as though you didn't do part of your study. So if we're talking about the library versus dorm versus classroom and time of day of tutoring, if we were looking at the main effect of, let's say, location, essentially what you would be doing is you would only be comparing people who studied in the library versus dorm room versus classroom. You would only be comparing those different settings, and you would ignore the other factor. So you would ignore what time of day they were studying and just look at the effect of the setting on its own. So the main effects, you're going to have a main effect for each of the factors that you've studied. So the number of main effects that you have to examine is equal to the number of factors that you have in your study. So each of the factors in your study, you're going to examine the main effect for. Also, you're going to look at interactions, which are the combined effects of more than one factor. And the reason I word it like this is you can have an interaction of just 2 different factors. You can also have an interaction of 3 different factors. So the main thing to take from this is you're looking at the degree to which these factors are combining to affect the outcome. So the way we talk about interactions is when we say the effect of one factor, it depends on the levels of the other one. So going back to that library versus dorm room versus classroom example, let's say that it's only effective to study in the library if you're doing it in the morning. No other time would it be effective to study in the library other than the morning. So another way to put that is the effectiveness of studying in the library, it depends on the time of day it is. So that would be an example of an interaction effect where the effectiveness of one location, it depends on the time of day. So let's talk a little bit more about the process of doing hypothesis tests in factorial ANOVAs. So as I mentioned before, the number of different hypothesis tests that you're going to be doing in your factorial ANOVA depends on how many factors you have. So each time you add a new factor, it adds a whole bunch of additional hypothesis tests that will need to be conducted. For that reason, we are only going to focus on the most basic type of factorial ANOVA, which is a factorial ANOVA using just 2 factors. So when you have a factorial ANOVA that is looking at the effect of 2 different factors, that's always going to result in 3 different hypothesis tests. So the 3 different hypothesis tests that we're going to conduct when we have 2 factors is we're going to have a main effect for each of our factors. So for example, we're going to have a hypothesis test that will examine the main effect for factor number 1. So again, the main effect, it just looks at the effectiveness of that one variable, ignoring the other one that you tested. So we'll have the main effect for factor number 1. We'll also have a hypothesis test that will look at the main effect for factor 2. So again, that will look at the second variable that you tested in your study and ignoring the first one. Last but not least, you will examine the interaction. So you'll have a hypothesis test that will look at the interaction between factor 1 and factor 2. So I'm going to go through an example in the next video to help us understand these different hypotheses that we're going to explore in a factorial ANOVA.